Belarus's latest economic figures tell a bleak story. Sluggish growth, widening trade deficits, rising inflation, and now even a potato crisis in a country long known as Europe's potato basket. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Belarus has survived on economic life support from Moscow, but as Russia's post-war boom fades, Belarus is also finding it harder to stay afloat. So in this video, we're going to explain Belarus's economic crisis and whether there's any way out. Dive deeper into politics with our magazine Too Long. Yep, we make a real physical magazine. In the latest issue, we discuss if Europe can really defend itself, why people like Putin get away with it, and whether we're observing the end of the American order. Find out more by clicking the link in the description. Let's get straight into it. Since the very much disputed 2020 presidential election, Belarus has been hit hard by Western sanctions. The incumbent Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, the first and only president of Belarus, who's been in power continuously since 1994, claimed victory with 80% of the vote, a result widely rejected at home and abroad. Lukashenko and his regime were accused of electoral fraud, and the EU, US, and Canada imposed sanctions targeting Belarus's key exports, such as petroleum exports and potash. By 2021, sanctions expanded to state-owned enterprises and financial institutions, and after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, launched partly from Belarusian territory, the EU treated Belarus as complicit in the invasion, ramping up restrictions to mirror those on Moscow. Entire sectors were blacklisted, including petrochemicals, transport, and fertilizers. By some estimates, sanctions directly affected a quarter of the Belarusian economy. Of its most important exports, potash fertilizer, saw production fall by over 50%. Trade with Ukraine, once Belarus's second largest market, fell from a peak of $6.9 billion in 2021 to just $1.6 billion in 2022, while exports to the EU dropped by over a half in the same year. This economic toll was sharp. In 2022, GDP contracted by 4.7%, industrial output fell 5.4%, and exports plunged by 20%. The EU also cut Belarusian banks off from the SWIFT payment system and banned transactions with the Central Bank of Belarus, and Belarus's critical IT sector was also hit hard. Up until then, IT companies have been a driving force in the economy, accounting for 6.4% of GDP in 2020 and employing tens of thousands of people. However, sanctions forced many IT companies and their staff to relocate, mainly to Lithuania and Poland, to keep their Western customers. Shut out from the West, Belarus reoriented its economy towards Russia. Moscow softened the blow by providing Belarus with preferential energy supplies in oil and gas at discounted prices, along with credit lines and extended debt repayments. Belarus also redirected exports that would have previously gone to the EU to Russia, with Belarusian exports to Russia rising by 50% in 2022, and agricultural exports alone up 70%. This did help to stabilize the economy, but it also meant that Belarus became increasingly dependent on what was happening in the Russian economy. This was fine while Russia's economy was enjoying a post-war boom. In fact, Belarus's economy originally staged somewhat of a comeback. According to World Bank data, Belarus grew an impressive 3.9% in 2023, having contracted by 4.7% in 2022. However, as Russia's economy has slowed under the weight of sanctions and war spending, Belarus's dependence on Russia has started to look increasingly unstable. For starters, Belarus's inflation rate has essentially mirrored Russia's since the invasion. Both countries saw a precarious spike in prices in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, with Russia's year-on-year inflation rate peaking at 17.8% in April 2022, and Belarus's peaking at 18.7% in June of the same year, the highest in over a decade. Inflation then fell in 2023, but thanks to excessive war spending, inflation has recently started rising again in Russia, bringing Belarus's up with it. Inflation has been running at about 10% in Russia since the start of the year, and Belarus's inflation rate has risen from 5.2% in January to 7.4% in July. A critical labour shortage has also made life increasingly difficult for Belarus, which has allowed workers to demand higher wages. This started after the political crisis of 2020, when thousands of Belarusians left the country. But somewhat ironically, it's been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, with thousands more Belarusians leaving the country to fill war-induced labour shortages in Russia. Anyway, rising wages are good for at least some workers, but they also create a new inflationary pressure and risk putting the entire Belarusian economy into a wage price spiral. To contain rising inflation, Lukashenko imposed price controls on staples such as potatoes in October 2022, hoping to keep food affordable. But, somewhat unsurprisingly, this policy quickly backfired. With input costs climbing faster than the state-set retail price, potato farming quickly became unprofitable. Farmers scaled back planting, and Belarus's potato harvest dropped from more than 4 million tons in 2023 to just 3.1 million in 2024. At the same time, farmers started looking abroad for better returns, with Russia, which is facing its own potato shortage, being the obvious place to sell. According to the independent think tank BROC, potatoes were selling for more than twice as much in Russia as they were in Belarus last year, with Russian prices rising as much as 92% year on year, driven by bad weather and Moscow's import restrictions. For context, before the war, Russia relied heavily on EU seed potatoes, but in early 2024, the Kremlin banned imports from unfriendly countries, slashing volumes by 93%. By November, Moscow scrambled to ease the crunch by allowing for more duty-free imports from friendly states such as Belarus, which resulted in Belarusian farmers selling more of their produce straight to Russia. While Lukashenko encouraged these exports at first, it only deepened shortages at home. So in December 2024, the government imposed a temporary 3-month ban on potato exports, including to Russia. But analysts at BROC reported that many farmers simply circumvented the ban, labeling good potatoes as spoiled and continuing to smuggle them across the border. The shortage soon became a political embarrassment, and in late May, Belarus reversed its ban on imports of certain foodstuffs, including potatoes from EU countries classed as unfriendly, in an attempt to ease the shortage. But more generally, as Russia's economy cools, Belarusian exports to its largest trading partner have suffered sharply. Shipments of consumer goods, machinery, and lumber fell by over 70% in the first half of 2025, and at the same time, Belarus's GDP grew just 2.1% year on year, less than half the 5% recorded in the same period in 2024, while key sectors like industry, transport, and IT showed almost no growth. Unable to borrow on international capital markets, Belarus has even apparently had to ask Russia for cash to help to plug its widening budget deficit. And the true scale of the downturn might actually be even worse. Belstat, Belarus's state statistics agency, has a history of withholding or manipulating data, and stopped publishing full reports on trade and industry in 2021, creating widespread suspicion that the official numbers understate the severity of its economic crisis. Evidently, with Russia's economy stalling and Lukashenko's policies stifling production rather than encouraging it, Belarus finds itself in a precarious position, isolated from the West, tied to a weakening Russia, and struggling to feed even its own people. Now, while information regarding Belarus is hard to come across in Western media, this story about female political prisoners in Belarus facing abuse has been covered thoroughly across the media landscape, with 36 sources reporting on it. Taking a closer look, you can see that just one of these came from the right, and 15 came from the left. It's also clear that there are vast differences between the different sides of the political spectrum, with the left using graphic and emotive language, focusing on individual suffering and highlighting personal testimonies, while more central outlets tend to frame women's suffering as part of a broader authoritarian crackdown. We're able to get into this depth of analysis thanks to our sponsor this week, Ground News, a website and app that collects articles from across the world, helping you to burst your media bubble. For every story, just like this one, you're able to see how many sources are reporting on it, as well as where those sources fall politically. And that's important, as the same story can take on a completely different meaning depending on how it's framed to us. Something we find helps us tackle this problem even further is their fantastic blind spot feature, a newsfeed dedicated to showing us which stories are improperly covered by one side of the political spectrum or other. Here you can expand your own viewpoint, or simply help you understand someone else's media reality. It's no secret that the current media landscape is constantly trying to capture your attention and sway you to one side or the other. So having a tool that helps you understand bias and how it affects the media you consume is extremely crucial. If you're interested in staying on top of the news and want to explore the amazing features that Ground News has to offer, we're offering 40% off their unlimited access Vantage Plan subscription if you use the link in the description, or scan the QR code on screen. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started today.